We're back for part 2. We are going to be looking at the things that we need to consider about retaining your teams. So we talked last time about the things you needed to think about and how they were employed or engaged or otherwise, what the implications of all that were. But having found wonderful, lovely people, then you probably want to keep them because hiring them is tiresome and expensive generally. Anyway, so let me wade straight in and pick on Alex to start with. So what can companies do to retain and incentivize staff?
Sure. So I suppose there's two angles of looking at this, Kath. One is sort of positive things, and then others are other contractual methods in which you can seek to retain staff by way of post-termination restrictions or essentially deterrent methods to make them reconsider if they are potentially considering leaving. In terms of sort of positive things, I mean, we talked quite at length last time about fruit bowls, velvetizers, all of those types of ways in which a small change to day-to-day office understanding or working relationships can actually make a really big difference in terms of developing a culture or just a continued attitude between everyone. But in terms of more formal steps, things to look at are bonus schemes, for example. So you might look at, in terms of depending on what your area is, if that's connected to sales, if that's connected to the overall success of the business, you could look at sort of a bonus incentive, which is only paid at a certain period of time each year and is also not going to be paid if someone has submitted their notice, for example, which is a good way of incentivizing people to essentially stay with you for a longer period of time than they may otherwise have done. So you can look at bonus schemes. You can also look at other benefits, so private healthcare, permanent health insurance. One that we're seeing quite a lot more now is company cars or electric cars. And I'm sure Sharon has some comments on that in terms of the tax position on that, because that's relatively unique. But in terms of incentives like that, they are all out there to be utilised. But I think the sort of key point to raise really is the one that we made last time, which is, as an early stage company, you might not necessarily need to or want to jump into all of those sort of more complex benefit arrangements. Most early stage companies, to be completely frank, will get themselves into a position where they have a clear understanding of what they want to achieve in their first year, using that first year as a sort of building block to seek further investment. And then once they've got that further investment, in collaboration with that investment panel, essentially make decisions on what the culture of the company might look like going forward. So one of the sort of key sort of foundations where I see things go wrong is a client or a company might come to us and say, we actually want a full detailed handbook. We want essentially a 100-page handbook to tell everyone what to do. And we found this online. That might work in certain circumstances, but equally, if you've got something off a line which complies to, you must wear a suit every day of the week, you must only work between 9 and 5, you must do X, Y, and Z, that doesn't really give the flexibility that sort of modern day employees are looking for. And I think, again, that flexibility is one of the key things to consider. So one of the other things that we see quite a lot now is flexible working, hybrid working. Do you really need to be in an office all of the time? And again, that works both ways, because essentially you might save on cost by having a shared workspace rather than having a particular site. So from your sort of initial costings, that could actually save you money. But that also has to be balanced with a collective identity and not just having people working remotely and potentially feeling isolated or not part of an organization. So there are two sides to that, but one of them, the major things, is sort of hybrid working at the moment. And then one of the other areas I touched on was other contractual provisions. So you've got post-termination restrictions as well, which I know I'm going to talk about a little bit later. So we can touch on that. But that's probably it from me for now, Kath.
So I'm going to go to Jeff and just see if we can explore a little bit around the options side of things there.
Perfect, thanks, Kath. So when we talk about options, what we really mean is as a right for the employee at a predetermined time in the future and at a predetermined price to purchase shares in the company. So the option is a right to purchase shares at some point in the future. They are widely used in startup and scale up companies. Most clients that myself and Nicola and Alex will act for will have some form of option scheme. And really the main reason for it is because, it, as Alex said, it retains staff, it helps to retain staff, because it gives them a bit of skin in the game. Quite often with scaling companies, even after a funding round, you still don't have the cash flow to be able to compete on a salary basis with big pharma, big tech companies, and so you have to offer other methods, I guess, of compensation, and options is the most common. It essentially, if someone has an option, they're not a shareholder at the point in which they have the option, but when they exercise that option, they will become a shareholder in the company, which means that as the company's value increases, the value of the shares that they hold increase and the value of their options increase. So it's a really nice way to give the option holders a financial return or a potential financial return if the company is successful, which we all hope it will be, in kind of the future growth and value of the company. So not only does it reward employees for work they've done up until the point in time at which the option is granted, but it also incentivizes employees to continue to stay working for the company and to continue to work hard while working for the company to grow the company's value to its absolute maximum. And when you think about it in that context, the option really aligns the interests of the employee to the interests of the founders and to the interests of the investors, because all three groups of people are kind of all pulling in the same direction, which is we want to grow this company to its biggest possible value, because that's going to generate the biggest financial return for all of us, and the employees can share in that under the options. Usually they don't have, we're not talking a large percentage of the company. Normally you have an option pool which is defined and set by your investors, somewhere around 10 to 15% of the company. And out of that pool, you will start granting options in smaller proportions to your employees. But it can be a really nice way to kind of tie them to the company in a way which is, is positive, in a way which can be sold to them nicely and purely and simply by the fact that, if you stay and the company increases in value, we achieve that big exit, your options will be valuable. But it's also a good way for the company, we can have checks and limits which control what happens to people's options if they leave the company, for example. So there is kind of the longer you stay, the more options you get. Oh, and if you leave, actually you may, we talked, I guess the first thing I said is it gives the employees skin in the game. If they choose to leave that game, then they choose to also leave behind their options or at least some of their options. When we talk about options, especially in the earlier kind of stages of a company's life, we tend to use the phrases unapproved options and EMI options. Unapproved options are just the default kind of options. They're nothing special. They're not part of any tax-approved scheme. They're just simply a right for option holders to purchase shares at some point in the company. And so they're subject to default tax rules around what happens, and Sharon can come on to that shortly. But just on that terminology, when we say unapproved, we don't mean kind of they're not approved by the company. We just mean they're not part of a approved tax scheme. The form of option scheme that you'll probably hear the most is an EMI share option scheme or an enterprise management incentive option scheme. Probably about 95% of our clients have EMI schemes. They are the most popular, they are the most common. The 5% that don't have EMI schemes wish they could, they just don't qualify for one reason or another. But the reason that they're the most popular form of option scheme in the UK at least is because they're probably the most tax advantageous way of getting equity to your employees. So, you know, when we talk about issuing employees options or issuing them shares or granting them options to later purchase shares, it raises a series of kind of taxable events. And the EMI option scheme is the most tax advantageous of all of those. So it's probably, Sharon, a good time to come across to you just for a kind of a high level on what those kind of tax liabilities and reliefs are.
I suppose if we forget the tax approved schemes for a moment and just talk about general options and how they are taxed, they aren't particularly very tax efficient unless you fall within one of the approved HMRC schemes. And if I can explain how that arises. So let's say, for instance, you have a option with a strike price of £1, and you have a company that does exceptionally well, and on exit, those shares can be sold for £100. So a nice gain, £99. Yes, that's great, everyone's happy, but then you have to work out what the tax liability on that might be. I guess there's always this general view that if you have shares or something related to shares, you will pay capital gains tax when you sell those shares, and capital gains tax rates, and we can come on to this in a moment, but generally are at 20%. However, if you have an unapproved option, in that scenario, if you change your options into shares on an exit, that £99 that I talked about is actually not subject to capital gains tax, but subject to both income tax, employers' national insurance, and employers' national insurance. And when you think, given the U-turn the government's just made, we still got a 45% tax rate. National insurance probably at a marginal rate is going to be 2%, and then you get 13.8% employers' national insurance. That can amount quite a significant amount of money that goes off to HMRC. Really, if you think about it, it puts the option holder in exactly the same position as they would be if the company had just paid them a bonus equivalent to that £99 per share. Clearly, that isn't great. It also puts the option holders in a very different position to the shareholders in the company. And therefore, there are various schemes that HMRC have put in place which give more tax advantageous outcomes than the one I've just described. And as Jeff said, by far the most flexible scheme, the one that has by far the most tax advantages, is the EMI options. And generally, apart from a few circumstances that we can potentially talk through, if people are interested, EMI options are available to most early stage spin out companies. What that means is that, going back to my example, if you change your options for shares just before an exit and you get that £99, effectively that is subject to capital gains tax rather than being taxed as a bonus, as I said a moment ago. What that means is that tax rates will be 20%, which is an awful lot lower. And then also there's another advantage of the EMI scheme, in that if you have held the options or the shares, if you've exercised a little bit earlier than this event for at least 2 years, and then potentially you are likely to qualify for something called business asset disposal relief. And what that does is that reduces the tax rate from 20% to 10%. So even a better outcome than than you might expect. So yeah, really, really good. I should just caveat by that saying, every individual only has £1 million of badger relief in their whole life. But typically with EMI options, the gains, if you're spreading them across your employees, would be somewhat less than that. And so, quite often you can get that 10% tax rate. So really, really good, and something that as a spin out you should be considering. There are a few cases where it may not apply to the company as a whole, but those, as I said, typically don't apply in a spin out situation. Perhaps more, the conversations that we are more likely to have on spin outs is where particular individual employees don't qualify for EMI. And that typically would be the case, for instance, for academics who still have their principal employment with the university or the spin-out institution, non-executive directors who might have a portfolio of companies that they work for and only work part-time for the company. Because to qualify for EMI, you either have to work 25 hours a week for the company that effectively is granting you the shares, or 75% of your total working time. So for instance, if you are a parent who only works 2 days a week for a company and looks after a child for the other 3 days, you would qualify. If you are an NED who only works 2 days a week for that company and spend your other 3 days working for other companies, then typically you wouldn't. But if you can qualify for EMI, it's as Jeff said, it really is the option scheme of choice, and the one that most small companies would opt for.
Obviously, if you come to a conclusion, you're going to put these in. I guess we're going to have to document them very carefully somewhere. So, practical perspective, how should we go about documenting them? Are we looking at employment contracts or something else? I don't know whether Alex or Jeff.
I can jump in, and then I can pass over to Alex to talk about maybe how we document some of the other kind of benefits that we can offer. But in terms of options, we strongly advise that they're always kept outside of the employment contract, and they're documented in a separate options document. Now, part of that is because there are some strict rules, especially when you're talking about the kind of tax advantageous schemes like EMI. There's some very strict kind of set of rules dictated by the legislation as to what needs to be in those contracts to make them a qualifying kind of EMI option. So firstly, there's a need to actually make sure we cover those off. And often, if you were just to put it in an employment contract, in the back of an employment contract, you're not going to meet those requirements. But there's actually a larger piece, which is, we want to create as much separation as possible in terms of any link between the employment situation and the options. Now, obviously, they are somewhat inherently linked because the options will often have leaver provisions that are tied to a person's employment, and we're granting them options because they are employed. But we want to say, we want to set out a position which is essentially, these options aren't linked to your these options aren't linked to your employment. They're not the options are not a remuneration of your employment. And the reason for that is pretty simple, which is that anything that is basically covered by your employment can be used against the company if there was an employment tribunal. So if someone was dismissed by the company and they bring an employment tribunal claim, if it was determined that the options were essentially part of the remuneration under the employment relationship, then when they bring a claim against the company, they can also claim for compensation for loss of their options. And obviously that could be quite a significant claim, given that if the options act as we intend them to, and if they increase in value, you're potentially looking at kind of an exponential graph of how valuable those options may be, and therefore what the claim may be. So we always say to try and keep as much separation as possible between the employment kind of status and the options, so that we're protected in an employment tribunal situation against claims. Then options should always be separate. But Alex, perhaps you can expand on some of the other ways to document benefits.
Yeah, sure. So essentially, just to sort of reflect on that as well, the way in which Jeff and I frequently do this in practice is essentially you will put an offer letter to an employee where you say, look, we'd love you to join our company. Here are the attached terms and conditions of employment. And then within sort of 2 or 3 minutes, you probably be sending them separate documentation in relation to the option. So it's under separate email cover. It is dealt with separately to, again, highlight that difference. But of course, there is a commercial reality there that if you're entirely silent and you just hand over the contract, one of the first things people are going to do is, well, what happened to the options that you mentioned? Where are they? So that's sort of how Jeff and I operate in practice with those types of arrangements. And then separately, In terms of things that you do have in an employment contract, as we've talked about, so you might have bonus schemes in there. In terms of other benefits, there were some changes in 2020 that sort of got buried in the midst of the pandemic. But essentially, there were some changes to employment legislation that required particular minimum terms to now be included in employment contracts. So that includes, for example, all types of leave that you offer. So do you offer any enhanced maternity, parental, shared parental leave, paternity leave? Do you offer any enhancements there? If not, you need to say that you're offering statutory only. In terms of benefits, do you offer any private healthcare? Do you offer a company car? Do you offer permanent health insurance? Do you offer any other type of benefit? Again, that needs to be in the employment contract. And then finally, in terms of other considerations, do you offer any training? So again, if you offer training that's compulsory or a requirement, then that needs to be in an employment contract. The one that's probably sort of slightly lighter in the employment contract is pensions. Typically, we advise that you just say you'll comply with your pension obligations to provide as much flexibility as possible. But obviously, in the background, you need to be making sure that anyone that needs to be auto-enrolled is auto-enrolled, speaking to your payroll or pension provider about how to document that and what documentation to share with your employees more widely. So that probably covers off the sort of positives. In terms of sort of more of a restraint, post-termination restrictions are quite a useful tool of retaining staff, and particularly retaining staff who potentially might be considering going to a competitor. So just to sort of set this out very briefly, because the whole focus of today really is on positive retention of staff rather than essentially trying to keep them against their will, which is not what post-termination restrictions are there to do, but they can have that deterrent effect. So in short, a post-termination restriction which prevents someone from essentially seeking a living is void as a matter of law, save for particular examples where there are justified cases of business protection. So that will include essentially protection of particular company interests, including trade secrets, confidential information, IP, essentially making sure that people don't poach all of your staff, so staff engagement, and also customers and suppliers. And in certain limited circumstances, it is possible, subject to level of those restrictions, the area in which they operate, the applicability to the particular individual, to have restrictions which prevent someone, for example, from joining a competitor for a period of time, for poaching employees for a particular period of time, for poaching customers for a particular period of time. But again, all of those do need to be considered in the round of what is the particular damage an individual will do, because one of the biggest sort of failures here is just to roll out all of your contracts exactly the same. So let's just say you had an admin assistant who was doing a couple of hours a week for you and your CEO. They were put on exactly the same contracts. Both of them, let's just say, had a 12-month non-compete provision in them. It's more likely than not that a court would go, well, you haven't actually considered what damage either of those individuals would do to the company. You've not bespoke them, and that could result in challenges to enforceability. And I'm very happy to have a separate discussion on that with anyone who would like one. But that just gives you an idea of another sort of term in an employment agreement, in addition to your confidentiality obligations and your IP obligations, which will be in there as well.
We've got quite a lot resting on options, clearly. Are there any other elements of options considered reasonable? Just anything further around the reality of how we make these options work within a particularly early stage spin out?
I guess there's kind of three different areas, and I can probably talk to two of them, and Sharon can come in on the third. So you kind of have dealing with your investors and the reality around setting the option pool and the like. You then have the actual documents themselves and what needs to be documented, and then you have, with the more tax efficient options such as EMI, actually having to deal with HMRC both before and afterwards. As you know, the trade-off for it being a tax-approved scheme is that you have to deal with HMRC and keep them informed and on a number of different bases. So the first of those, in terms of dealing with investors and the like, is that when everyone understands that options especially are a really good way to incentivize staff and grow and scale the company. So pretty much universally, investors will be on board with there being some form of option scheme because they are hugely valuable. However, they're not just going to give you carte blanche to go and do whatever you like and just issue as many options as you want to everyone. So we've kind of mentioned the concept of an option pool a couple of times, and essentially it's just the maximum number of options that you can grant to employees, and that's usually determined as part of a fundraising or spin out, where you kind of come to a negotiated position on what the option pool size will be. Market dictates it's usually 10%. It can sometimes be around 10 to 15%, but really the option pool needs to be of a size which means that you can meet your hiring plan and you can between funding rounds essentially. So there should be an exercise where as part of every round you sit down and you say, well, actually, what's our hiring plan in between the completion of this round and the start of the next round? Who are we looking to bring in? How many options will we need to grant to those people in terms of percentages? And then actually, what do we have left in the pool, maybe from a previous round, or how much do we need generally? It is possible on different funding rounds, if not before, for that option pool to be topped up, but that's not it's not a guarantee. It's something that will need to be discussed with your investors. So it really is the job of the company to protect that option pool, not just to rush out and grant everyone kind of 2% of the company and then very quickly decide that actually we don't have room in the option pool to finish granting options to the rest of the people that we want to hire in the future. There is a need to protect that pool, and there are a number of different ways in which you can decide how many options to allocate. So there are some really good option number calculators online. Index Ventures has a really good one which is free to use. Some people do it based on salary. So there's kind of they would say, okay, everyone gets 50% of their salary in options, and that 50% is based on the last fundraising price. So if your salary was 40,000, then 50% of that would be 20,000, and if your last fundraising price was £2 a share, everyone that employee would have 10,000 options. They'll then have an exercise price which is agreed with HMRC, which Sharon can come on to. Some people do it more based on less mathematical methods, but perfectly acceptable methods where they just use the general market standard approaches of how many options to grant. So junior employees would normally receive between 0.1 to 0.3%, if somewhere in that figure. C-suite, more senior employees would receive kind of your 0.5 to 1.5%. You may have a chairman that comes in and the chairman would take unapproved options, but that would be more in the 1.5 to 2% bracket. They normally command a bit of a heftier option fee. So there are many different ways in which you can kind of structure it. And we can obviously talk when we talk to our clients and talk them through how those can be used. Once you have an option pool, once you know who you're going to grant options to, then you need to document the options. The way that we structure our option grants is very similar to how most people will structure their option grants, so essentially, or their option documents. And essentially, there's two key documents. You have an overarching share option plan, which is very much a framework document. So it's pretty thick. To be honest, it's pretty boring, and I draft it, but there's nothing commercially sensitive in there. It's a framework. It's a process document. It touches on things such as who can be granted options, who can grant options, the mechanics behind making the option grants, the mechanics behind making the option exercise, like making option exercises and actually exercising the options. And when we talk about option exercises, it normally occurs around an exit event, so a share sale or an IPO or an asset sale. And each of those are slightly different in terms of how they're structured. So therefore, the mechanics of how you exercise the options in those circumstances are also different. So that's why it becomes quite a thick document, because we need to cater for every single exercise scenario. If it's an EMI scheme, then there'll also be a load of information around, just making it statutory compliant and in line with the code. The second document, to me at least, is the much more exciting and fun one, because that's the option grant contract, which is actually the contract that you enter into with the option holder, and that actually sets out what those options are. The first half of it will set out, here's your option entitlement, here's how many options you're getting, this is the exercise price, etc. And then the rest of the document kind of deals with the key variables around the options. There's kind of 4 or 5, and I'll very quickly run through them at a high level. But the first is vesting. So usually all of the options are granted, in upfront in one go, and that's mainly to lock them in at the lowest possible exercise price you can agree with HMRC, and I'll let Sharon come on and talk about that shortly. But that doesn't work as a good incentive if you just give everyone all of their options up front. So normally the options vest over time, and what we mean by vesting is that when options vest, they become exercisable. Doesn't mean necessarily that you can exercise the options at that stage, but it just means that when you're able to exercise them, the vested options will be exercisable. Usually those options, that vesting schedule is time-based, so it's purely on time. The market standard is what we call 4 years, 1 year cliff, which means the options vest over a period of 4 years. Nothing happens for the first 12 months, but then at the end of the first 12 months, you have 25% of your options vested in one lump sum, and the remaining 75% then vest either monthly or quarterly, usually over the remaining 3 years in equal tranches. You can have other forms of vesting, so you can have performance-based vesting, you can have different kind of weighted time vesting. Those are normally used in certain situations. So performance-based vesting, for example, we need to have clear, measured, objective performance targets. So they're normally used more for sales staff, where you can kind of judge how many options vest against kind of sales targets and figures. I mentioned that just because they're vested doesn't necessarily mean that you can exercise them at that time. And the second variable to consider is actually, when can the options be exercised? In the UK, most of the options are exercisable on an exit event, and that's kind of the defining event when you can actually exercise your options. 2 reasons. One is, for the option holder, the exit event is the most likely time when they will make a financial return from their options. That's the big event that the company's driving to. Some option holders say, well, what about dividends? But the reality of the situation is most companies that I work with, those kind of scaling technology companies, they're not going to be dividend generating. A lot of the companies won't make a profit before they exit, and the ones that do make a profit will likely pump those profits back into the company to help it grow and scale up. So dividends are kind of off the table. The financial return is the big kind of ticket for the option holders. And with that in mind, it's much easier for the company to just say to everyone, well, you can exercise on an exit event. The reason being is that when someone does want to exercise, there's quite a lot of admin involved on the company side. So we want to minimize that as much as possible, so that the board and the management team can actually go on and grow and scale the company and don't have to be continuously bogged down with option exercises. There are some exceptions to that rule. So, if an option holder sadly dies in service, or for people who leave the company and who we want to exercise options, normally they can exercise within a certain amount of time so that they can lock in the tax treatment. But generally speaking, most schemes are exit only. Probably about 95% of the schemes that we see are exit only. Quite often there is a question to be had around, okay, so the options vest over time, you can exercise them on an exit event, but what happens if we're only kind of 3 years into a 4-year vesting cycle? Do the unvested options accelerate or not? So that's one of the variables that need to be considered. It's developed recently into quite a nuanced point that needs to be carefully considered. There's no real market standard, and most people, there's so many different competing interests. You have the interests of the company, the founders, the employees. You have the interests of the potential acquirer. So an acquirer will likely want your team to transition across to them. So they may not be too fond of acceleration on an exit event, because it gives the option holders more of the sale proceeds. And the thinking from acquirers is that it makes them less likely to transition across and more likely to say, well, I've just received a nice windfall. Actually, I'm going to take a year out and go off and do all of the stuff that I've always wanted to do. My personal thoughts are that it's for the acquirer to worry about that and incentivize the team that they want to transition across. But my personal thoughts are not the reality. And so it does need to be considered. What most people tend to do is they say, actually, this is such a nuanced decision to come to. I can't possibly make it now, not knowing what the exit event is going to look like. So instead, we're just going to kind of park the bus on this decision, and we're going to say that the options may accelerate on an exit event if we decide to, on a case-by-case basis at the time. Up until about 2 years ago, that was fine and accepted without any issues at all. And then in January 21, HMRC made a pretty rogue decision at the time when they said that actually exercising that discretion to accelerate options invalidated the EMI status of those options. And HMRC's basis for that decision was that there's a long-standing rule that once the options have been granted, if you make any amendments to a fundamental term of the option, such as vesting, etc., then that's considered by HMRC to be an event that causes EMI to be lost. It always used to be the case that exercising discretion that's already built into the documents isn't amending the contract, because the contract allows you to do that. So the HMRC decision kind of flew in the face of that kind of long-standing opinion. It was a very rogue decision. It kind of sent shockwaves through me. It probably sent shockwaves through Sharon and the rest of the kind of community. And we're still, 2 years later, it's still a grey area. So we've had clients that have applied to HMRC to exercise discretion, and HMRC have told them it's fine to do it. We weren't involved in the company who HMRC made the rogue decision against, so I don't know what the actual wording of their document said. So it's always something to take advice on. I think where we are now is to say that discretion is fine. It's fine to have discretion in the contracts. It's not going to invalidate EMI status. But before you exercise that discretion, speak to someone like myself or someone like Sharon and get some advice before you do that. The final one before I hand over to Sharon is around what we do with levers. So we want obviously people to have options, but it ties into the fact that they're pulling together to grow the value of the company. And if someone, as I said earlier, if someone chooses to walk away, or if someone leaves the company, we need to decide what we do with their options. And it's quite important because it ties into the fact that we have a set defined option pool, and we need to protect the sanctity of that option pool. So if everyone that left the company was allowed to keep their options, we would very quickly run out of room in the option pool, which means we wouldn't have the options that we need to bring in new employees, but also to bring in replacement employees. So you're all founders, you've all kind of got companies that's scaling, so you're probably quite used to, again, what I consider quite corny terms of good lever, bad lever, but they're kind of the market standard that we use, and it's similar to options. We will have good levers and we will have bad levers. Bad levers just lose everything, all of their options lapse, and they return to the option pool. Good levers typically are allowed to keep their vested options, and in most cases are allowed to exercise those options within 90 days of leaving, so that they can exercise those options and have that income tax relief that Sharon mentioned earlier. The big decision, therefore, is actually how we define good levers and bad levers. There's some really obvious things like a bad lever will always be someone who commits gross misconduct or fraud or theft or dishonesty against the company. Good levers are normally anyone that's not bad, so that's quite simple. But there is a decision to be made around how do we treat those that resign, and it's a really difficult decision, and the market is split. So some people say that the culture that I want is that we want people to work hard, and we want people to grow the value of the company, and for whatever time they're here doing that, that's great, they can have those options. we want to promote a culture where people grow and develop and then go off and do their own things. So, if you resign, you're a good leaver, that's fine. Other people take the view that if you, we don't know why people will resign. So I genuinely have a company that we've acted for a number of years where someone went to Australia on holiday, they went to a bar, they met a barmaid, they fell in love, apparently, and they came home, and within 3 months they were resigning from our company to go and move to Australia to meet up with the barmaid and live happily ever after. I have it on very good authority that they are still currently together for almost 3 years later. So clearly that was a good life decision. But also, for that employee, they worked really hard for 3 years. They were almost, pretty much a model employee. So clearly, we don't care about them resigning. Obviously we care, but in terms of the options, we don't mind. We want them to have their options and benefit from the time they spent here. There are other situations where someone may resign and go and join a competitor, and we probably don't want people and competitors holding shares in our company. So, it's difficult to consider resignation because we don't know at the time people resign exactly why they are resigning. We may never know, and so those companies say, well, actually, look, we need to protect the company. We completely get the cultural arguments for having resignation as a good lever, but we need to protect the company. We need to protect the option pool. So the default position will be that resignation is a bad lever event, but we'll have discretion to make them good levers. And that's really just to protect the company in those situations. And from an optics point of view, the argument there is that it's better optics to say to someone, well, you resign, so you would have been a bad lever, but actually the company is choosing to make you a good lever because of how well you've done. That's a nice situation compared to someone resigning as a good lever, you then finding out they've worked they're working for a competitor and trying to do anything you can to claw those options back. The optics on that are not as good. So it's a difficult decision. The market split, I resonate, with both sides of the argument. And I think on different days I would pick different options. So it's tough, but it's something to work through. And I've probably spoken enough. So I'm going to hand over to Sharon to talk about kind of how we have to engage HMRC on the option schemes.
Thanks, Jeff. That's a great canter through what's a very difficult subject. And I guess what I'm taking from what you're saying, and certainly our experience as well, is that, clients can come to us and say, we want to put an EMI option scheme in place, and think that that's just a quick boilerplate, let's get an agreement and let's move forward. Whereas actually, it's really important that a lot of that thought process is done up front. And certainly I can name, quite a number of companies that, didn't really think through those alternatives at the outset and come to us and say, oh, I wish I hadn't given X as many options as I did, or because I've now not got anything left for hires, or got all these levers who are giving me grief because I've let them keep their options and they're working for a competitor, and all those sorts of things. So definitely worth putting the time up front to think through the different implications and then to get advice on that. To add a further complication, a decision also has to be made at what price you're going to expect your employees to buy their shares when they exercise their options, and that's referred to quite commonly as the exercise price or the strike price. And again, there are a number of alternatives here. If you're dealing with EMI options, which are the tax efficient ones, and therefore then if you reflect back what I was saying a few moments ago, these are quite tax incentive, quite attractive from a tax perspective. And therefore, what HMRC don't want you to do is reward people for growth in the company at a time when they weren't there. So obviously, beginning, startup, just incorporated, probably got really low value. Hopefully by an exit, it's worth quite a lot of money. And as it grows through that period, some employees will join, some will be at the start, some will join a third of the way through, some half the way through, etc., etc. And so what the revenue are very keen on is that you only get these tax incentives effectively from the time you grow and are working for the company until the exit. And the way that they control that is they will say that the strike price or the tax advantages will only apply to based on the strike price, which is an agreed value of the company at the time that the employee gets the options. So let's just say you've had a funding round and that values the company at 2 million. And let's say that's, I don't know, £20 a share from the investors. One of probably the most easiest option you can take is you say, well, the investors have just invested at £20 a share, so we are going to have a strike price in our options at £20 a share. Very easy. You can agree that with HMRC. There's lots of sort of external evidence from that. And there are some investors out there in the marketplace that will insist on that. They will say, because we've invested at £20 a share, we are only going to grant options to our employees at £20 a share. There are probably more, though, but certainly in our experience, investors who actually don't take that view, and they say, well, actually, we want our employees to have the maximum benefit that we can possibly give them with these options. Accepting we pay £20 a share, we don't necessarily want the employees to have to pay that. Please, can you go off to HMRC and talk to to correspond with them to try and get a lower price? And this is something we do quite frequently. And normally HMRC will accept a lower price than in my example, £20 that the investors invest. How much lower is a little bit, how long's a piece of string? If I'm being brutally honest, it probably depends on whose desk in the valuations team at HMRC the letter that you write to them lands on. But you will be able to get lower. Quite a few reasons for that. One is typically the investors take a large chunk of shares. Employees, even if it's, one of the key employees is probably only a much smaller percentage. Some of the sort of more junior employees probably a much, much smaller percentage. And the revenue do accept that, people who have bigger tranches of shares will pay more per share than those that don't. And that's something called a minority discount, which a term you might hear bandied about. The other sort of examples that we can possibly use is that sort of investors typically might have some sort of restricted rights as to what they have some influence in the company. They probably have a seat on the board, etc. Some more junior option holders wouldn't be in that position. Also, the way that you look at values and what information is available to people, big institutional investors will probably invest on the hope value of the company. They might have done due diligence on the technology. They'll have seen cash projections, etc. All sorts of information that you wouldn't typically assume would be available to an employee who is just buying a very, very small number of shares. And the tax rules say that you can for very small shareholders, you can just look at historic information and not look at all that sort of future information. So lots of different ways to get that valuation down. Typically, you write to HMRC, you set out all your reasons for evaluation. They're pretty quick at the moment, coming back 3 or 4 weeks. They will give you an answer as to whether they think that what you've submitted them is the right amount. So, as I'd say, it's more often than not, we will go for that discounted value, but worth just checking with investors because some of them just don't like it and won't allow it. And if you then grant your options at that market value, everything's fine and you can move forward. There are a couple of other times we would also go to HMRC. One is there is a clearance procedure ahead of granting EMI options as to whether the company is the sort of company that will qualify for EMI options. Not something that's always done as a matter of course, because for a lot of companies it's a no-brainer that they do qualify. But sometimes, depending on the trade or on the ownership structure, etc., there can be a little bit of ambiguity. So if there is any, you can actually go to HMRC in advance and get clearance, and that is something that is done in a minority of cases, but is done. The really most important thing with EMI, though, where you have to engage with HMRC, is in actually registering the options, and that has to be done within 92 days of the paperwork being done. If you don't do that and you haven't got a reasonable excuse for not doing it within the 92 days, then I'm afraid those options aren't EMI options and don't get the tax advantage that we've been talked about. It's very easy in a startup situation, and you're trying to, executives are trying to do, wear lots of hats all at the same time to forget, but not something you do want to forget, because it is, as we've explained, the tax can be very, very different, and it's not fun if you get towards exit and then realise someone hasn't quite filled in the bits of paper that they should have done at the start. Obviously, with an approved options, if you don't fall into the EMI, you can choose whatever value you want as your strike price in the option, subject to the agreement of the directors, shareholders and investors. So, you don't have to go through that valuation process, but there is actually a process of also telling HMRC that you've granted those options, albeit that that's done annually rather than in the 92 days that I was talking about. So lots of things to do.
It's all a fairly complicated space, and we've got one or two requests about whether there is any kind of documented procedure. But I'm guessing, or any kind of cheat sheets, but I'm guessing that this probably has to be pretty well bespoke per company to get the advice appropriate to their individual circumstances. I'm going to throw that over at Jeff and Alex, I think, or Nicola, if you're feeling energetic, Nicola.
Yeah, that's correct, Kath. Really, the variables, although I kind of canted through what we see in the marketplace, the reality is that, we have many clients that do slightly different things around different variables. There are choices to be had, there are discussions to be had. Sharon mentioned the valuation, and just on the valuation piece, everyone's valuation will be different depending on their financial position, their shareholdings, their share structure, whether they have preference shares or not. Quite often we have clients come to us and say, well, actually, this is the valuation we want, because we've spoken to a load of our peers that have similar staged companies, and this is the valuation they've achieved. And you kind of have to, say to them, well, it's not as simple as that. There are, it's a more nuanced piece again. So there are options to be had. It does need to depend on, individual company share structures, etc. There's a process. It's not, it's not, documented anywhere, but there is, a process of, okay, step one, we prepare the documents, get the valuation. Here's what you have to do to register, etc. Which we can talk you through at the time, but there's no kind of one size fits all, here's your option scheme.
And I would just add to that in terms of sort of war stories, and my sort of whole back catalogue of war stories. But I think one of the things that sort of we've seen on more than one occasion is where people come to us thinking they have granted EMI share option schemes, and what they've done is they've borrowed their friend's share option scheme, or another portfolio company of the same investor has given them an example of their scheme, and therefore it must be fine. And then what they do is they go through and they go, oh, well, that's not relevant to us, and take it out, and that's not relevant to us, and take it out. And what they're actually doing is taking out things that actually have to be in there in order for it to be a scheme that would qualify to have the benefit of EMI. So we've certainly seen that more than once, where they suddenly, sort of discover 7 or 8 years later down the line that actually the options they've been granting for the last 8 years actually aren't EMI options. And then you have quite a lot of unhappy people in general. And also I think, I remember, I said, luckily we managed to catch in the bud, where we had somebody come to us saying, oh, well, we don't need to pay you the full amount to do a share option scheme because we've already got some scheme rules. We just need you to red flag them. And we sort of got the scheme rules. It's these look like something that we might have drafted for another company, and actually that company that we had originally drafted it for actually has some very specific wording in there around vesting. And when you go to flick through, and lo and behold, there was the exact same vesting schedule that we'd drafted for the original company. We then actually had to point out to them that had they executed this EMI scheme, that actually none of the options that they were about to grant would ever vest, because of this very bespoke terms that we had around sort of the vesting for the original company. So I think what I would say is that it's very easy to get this wrong, and it's most definitely not a case where you sort of ask Dr. Google or ask your friend, because there are things in there which are in there for a reason, and it's very easy to move what should be a qualifying scheme into basically a scheme that is invalid for EMI, and often you don't find that out until somebody comes and does due diligence on it in a potential sort of later stage investment scenario, or indeed an exit, when it can be a bit upsetting.
I was going to say that the final thing to add to that, Nicola, is that there have been situations where even when we have drafted initial documents for people that were perfectly compliant at the time, HMRC do change their policies, as kind of evidenced by that piece around discretion. So HMRC do change their policies. There hasn't been a big change to option compliance terms for a number of years, but every now and then HMRC will change, or they may add something in which needs to be changed. There's been changes to a good example is we prepared documents for a client at the start of 2014. And at that time, it was perfectly acceptable for companies just to say the companies kind of self-declared that their employees met the working time requirements around EMI options, that you work kind of 25 hours a week on average, etc. And then in mid-2014, that rule changed, and the option holder themselves then had to sign a document declaring that they met those working time requirements. And that became a hardwired requirement for EMI options. The company in question did not come back to us after 2014, and tell us that they were granting more options at any single point in time. But behind the scenes, they had been using the same documents we drafted in 2014 and just granting options the whole time. So essentially all of the options from 2014 onwards are not qualifying EMI options, because they don't contain any declaration from the option holder themselves that they actually meet the working time requirements. So the point there is that you may have perfectly good documents and they may be perfectly compliant when they're put in place, but actually with the tax approved schemes, whenever you're looking to grant them, especially if it's after a fundraising or if it's been a period of time, you also need to just check back in with whoever provided those documents just to make sure that they're still compliant then, because it won't affect options that have already granted, but you may need to make some tweaks and changes on an ongoing basis to make sure new option grants are still fine. So I appreciate it sounds like there is a lot of work to do with the tax approved schemes, and there is a little bit more admin, but it is obviously definitely worth it for your option holders and your employees.
I'm going to add a war story of having been involved in a company where precisely this situation existed, that they had put together an option scheme. They had, by some magic, assumed it had all been, it was all acceptable. It was discovered that it was not acceptable. And one of the employees sued the company, and it became a very unpleasant situation, because the company claimed that due to the failure of the management, they were going to be losing out substantially, and they were wanting to claim the difference between what they should have had and what they would actually have ended up with. So that was not a happy situation. Fortunately, it was resolved in a positive manner, but there was much unhappiness for a protracted period of time. And as you can imagine, it didn't lead to the members of the company doing an awful lot of work towards furthering the company, just an awful lot of work preventing chaos. So that was a bit of a disaster. Okay, got a few more questions lurking around there. So James said he's seen a lot of restrictions in employment contracts that appear to be far from reasonable. What sort of guidance can you give? Can these actually be enforced, or where does the line fall here? Well done, Alex. Well volunteered.
No, sure. So, I mean, unfortunately, James, it's one of those areas where each contract will need to be considered in its own individual circumstances. So, again, the main underpinning of this is what particular role is that individual doing? What damage have they caused to the business? Were the restrictions drafted to an extent to potentially protect those interests, or were they just general restrictions that were just taken from the internet? The other side of it is obviously each employee does have an opportunity at the time that they are entering into a contract to negotiate it and take legal advice if they want to. So the fact that an employee signs a contract also does a degree of damage to their own position, because essentially the argument is, well, if you didn't think that was reasonable, you had an opportunity to take advice, you chose not to. And sometimes also some particular clauses along these lines say expressly, you have had the opportunity to take legal advice and you understand that these restrictions go as far as reasonably necessary. So they're the sort of considerations. The other thing to add to that is, in terms of realities, really much will depend on both sides of the coin, really. So if you are an employer that's lost someone and they're absolutely business critical, you probably will go to the stage of at least sending a letter to them. You might also send a letter to their new employer, essentially saying that that new employer has induced a breach of contract, with the hope that new employer or employee might cave. And if not, then you potentially might look at injunctive relief or seeking damages. That's a costly process, but depending on the individual in question, it might happen. It's certainly more likely to happen for senior employees. I mean, I think you wouldn't necessarily see it for a more junior person, and certainly someone who's not been exposed to a whole host of IP or confidential information. So that's really probably as far as I can go, but ultimately each situation will be different and each contract will be assessed on its merits.
So also from James, so regarding EMI, if there's an academic founder who works predominantly at the host university and certainly less than the 25 hours a week at the spin out, then ignoring the personal tax situation of the employee, is there also an imposed NI liability on the company by virtue of the employee not qualifying? And then what happens if they become full-time at some point subsequently? I love the complicated ones.
Shall I take that one as it's tax?
Lovely, thank you.
Yeah, so it's not straightforward. Whether employers NI applies will depend on the circumstances at the time of the shares are exercised. But as we said before, typically that is at the time of exit. And employers NI, and indeed employees NI for that matter, kicks in if the shares are what's called a readily convertible asset. And what that means is that at the time that you exercise those shares, there is a mechanism in place which will allow you to convert that very quickly into real money rather than just holding the shares. And if you think about an exit event, typically what happens is the shares are exercised, let's say in the morning, and then the share sale goes ahead in the afternoon or a couple of days later or whatever it is, but very, very closely, certainly after there's an offer letter for the purchase of the company or something like that. So the HMRC are very clear in those circumstances. They see their shares as something that's readily convertible into money, and therefore both employers and employees and I apply. So yes, there would be. If you had a scheme where very early on someone exercised their shares, say within 6 months of getting them, and there was no sale anywhere at all on the horizon, standalone company, no market, not a PLC, something like that, then it wouldn't. But typically in the spin out space, that's not something that we very regularly see. So that's the first question. I suppose the second part of the question is hinting that if you are in a situation where you have never you haven't qualified for EMI, but you've got some options. If then at a later stage you actually do qualify for EMI because you're working for more time for the company, unfortunately that doesn't morph your unapproved options into EMI options. What you would have to consider doing at that time, if you did then meet this working time requirement, is cancelling all your original options and issuing you with EMI options at the time you did qualify. Generally, there is nothing to stop you doing that. But if you remember, I was saying that as the history of the company goes on and the valuation typically goes up, you can only do EMI options at the or get the tax advantages based on the valuation of when you get your EMI options. So if that's very close to exit, for instance, there might not be too much advantage of doing it, but each situation is different, and you can look at that. So but yeah, the big takeaway is if you do suddenly qualify for EMI, go and get some advice and see if it would be helpful to get your options cancelled and re-granted so that you can fall within the scheme.
One from Hong. Can you explain something about warrants and the benefits and difference between options and warrants?
A warrant is essentially a right at some point in the future, at a predetermined time, at a predetermined price, to purchase shares in the company. And if you think that sounds very similar to what I said about options, you would be right. A warrant essentially has the same effect as an unapproved option, so that you can't have tax advantage warrants, but the effect is the same. Both unapproved options and warrants give the holder the right to purchase shares in the company at some point in the future for a predetermined price. They would be taxed the same. An unapproved option would be taxed the same as a warrant. For some unbeknownst reason, they are different. To be perfectly honest, other than the fact that options are generally granted to individuals and warrants are generally granted to companies, I've never really been able to ascertain what the difference between them is. I've had many discussions with lawyers who have been doing this for many, many years, more than I have, and we still all get to the same position, which is we don't really know. For some reason, the way the documents are structured are different. They may have you may have slightly different terms, but to be perfectly honest, you can grant options to companies. You could grant warrants to individuals. You could have similar clauses and provisions in either. Really, obviously, with EMI option, that's talking about kind of unapproved options. There are, restrictions on what you can do with the tax efficient ones, but essentially, unapproved options and warrants they're not one and the same, but they're, the effect of them is the same. Nicola, feel free to chime in if
I agree. So because I'm really old, I kind of remember sort of warrants really were a thing, and it was quite a transatlantic thing, in that you used to get sort of in particular US individuals absolutely insistent on having warrants, and you would talk to them about options, and it's like, no, they wanted warrants. They wanted a piece of paper that said warrant, and in their mind an option was something very different to a warrant, but all it is an entitlement to shares. And at one point in time there, which Sharon might have more background to it, but at one point in time there was a whole thing about bearer warrants and who held the bit of paper at what particular point in time, and you used to use it for primarily kind of like for offshore tax structuring. But yeah, kind of they're one and the same things. I think at one point in time you used to be able to write a warrant on a cow. I do think that's one of those sort of English legal history things stuck in the back of my head from when I was at uni, and you kind of have these quirky things to do with English law around chasing sheep down high streets and that kind of thing. But I'm fairly certain at one point in time you could write a warrant on a cow.
I think the only thing I've seen, and I'm going back many, many years, and I don't even know if it's still possible, is warrants sometimes were transferable. So you could transfer a warrant from one person to another. Typically, I don't think I've ever seen an option that's transferable, and I don't know, I've no idea whether legally I guess you could possibly do both. But it is interesting. I mean, I have had lots of conversations with individuals who've been given warrants over the years. And I think they've been given warrants because the lawyers have been drafting warrants for companies, and therefore it's just been easier and simpler to replicate those for individuals rather than doing some sort of a different option plan. And they certainly haven't appreciated the horrible tax implications that could arise on the individuals where they do have warrants. And certainly, you know, they were never told that on exercise, you know, typically directors on exercising those option warrants, they would get, you know, potentially some quite horrendous tax charges. So something to watch out for.
I just need to correct my English legal history. It wasn't a warrant that you could write on the side of a cow, it was a cheque. So
Oh, yeah.
just in case anybody was thinking of doing the same.
Yes, and actually, if you're a free man, or I presume woman of the City of London, you have the right to drive sheep over Tower Bridge, I believe. So, you know, today's useless facts have been
never say these sessions aren't educational, you know, never mind about, you know, sort of employment law and incentives. Last week it was velvetizers, this week it's the fact you can write a cheque on a cow.
Oh, and it is my belief that Ken Livingstone has exercised this right. So, but anyway, let's leave that one there. I can't verify it because the original conveyor of this information is now deceased, so I can't go back and check with him. Anyway, on the topic of useless facts, are there any more questions that we can answer here? If I missed anything, it's there were a lot of things came in. Just wave your hand about if you've got something that remains unanswered that you'd like us to answer. Well, I'm taking silence as assent. Okay.
Sorry, one question from me. It's Cashew from Oxford RF. So it was mentioned that the vested shares may be kept by good leavers, and obviously there was a lot of discussion around that. So I understand that. I wanted to understand the difference between, as in focusing on the EMI. So can the EMI options be vested as well, or do they lapse in all cases when an employee leaves?
Yes. Sorry for any kind of confusion around that. So it's when you have EMI options, and you're talking about good leavers. So good leavers can keep their vested. We call it vested shares because that's how it's defined in our documents. But essentially, we mean vested options at that stage. So because they are options over shares that have vested. So it is quite, you know, if you are a good leaver, you can retain those vested options. But if you are to also retain the benefits of the EMI scheme, i.e. being able to exercise without an income tax liability, then the option holder needs to exercise those options within 90 days of their employment end date. If they exercise that, you know, it may be possible under the scheme for them to exercise outside of that period, but if they do so, they're just going to be taxed as unapproved options.
Yeah, and as Jeff said before, that we're seeing some complications in there because some of the older schemes pre to HMRC changing their mind, as they're meant to do, would say that they, you know, let's say that you know, the option scheme is exercisable on an exit unless directors allow them to be exercised early. And typically one of the reasons why they might have done is someone leaves, and if that's now the case, HMRC's view is probably that if the directors exercise that discretion and allow early exercise, it can actually invalidate the EMI status. So there's a lot of complications around leavers, looking at what the documentation says, looking at what the board wants, and then looking at HMRC's view of the whole thing. So I'd certainly say make sure you know, just don't make assumptions, but take advice at the time to make sure you get it correct.
Yes, that's helpful. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Thank you again, Sharon, Jeff, Alex, and wisdom from Nicola. And so thank you very much. And we'll see everybody in 2 weeks' time. The Zoom link, is it the same Zoom link each time? We don't need to.
I don't know, Callum, you will get when you get a reminder, and that reminder will have a Zoom link attached to it. I think they're different each time so that we can have different recordings.
Excellent. Okay, that makes sense.
But you will be sent a reminder with the Zoom link and that within a diary invite.
Perfect. So we'll see you in 2 weeks' time, and also a reminder to make sure that you're available for the in-person.
Oh yes, we'll give more. We'll send out some more details on that in due course.
In due course, velvetizers may be available.
They may. Well, we had that whole discussion. Yes, velvetizers will be available.
Excellent.
Not least just to ensure that, you know, kind of Jeff and Alex make it over to Oxford, never mind anything else.
bribed by a velvetizer. Goodness gracious.
Indeed. Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you
Right.
ever so much.
Speak to you
All, and
soon.
we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Okay.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank
Goodbye.
you.